All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on digital identity and the future of onboarding. My name's Claire Tolley. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Onfido, and my background is across digital identity, payments, and financial services. And I'm excited today to be joined by my colleague, Amy Shuart, who is the Head of North America Government Affairs at Onfido, and Jeremy Grant, who is the Managing Director at Venable LLP. So before we get into our discussion, Amy and then Jeremy, if you'd like to share a few words about your backgrounds, we can get started.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Really great to be here with you today and appreciate Jeremy joining us as well. My name's Amy Shuart. I'm Head of North America Government Affairs for Onfido. Prior to joining Onfido, I spent about a decade on Capitol Hill working in senior level roles.
And I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm a managing director in Venable's Technology and Innovation Group. We're a law firm based out of Washington, D.C., though I'm not a lawyer. Co-manage what's about a 20-person strategy practice, helping clients at the intersection of law and other issues around cybersecurity and privacy, and most importantly for today's conversation, digital identity. I've been working in this space over 25 years. Once was a Senate staffer, also working on Capitol Hill here in D.C., also ran the digital identity team at NIST for several years, and really excited for the invite to participate today. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. So we have a big topic ahead of us today, digital identity and the future of onboarding. Now, you'll hear a lot of terms used to describe new or emerging methods of digital identity verification, whether that's EIDs, could be reusable identities, could be self-sovereign identities using blockchain. And you might be wondering, what does a digital identity look like? Is it a digital version of a government issued document, or is it more than that? Is it things like loyalty programs that somebody's a part of? Is it things like COVID vaccination status? Are there different claims that make up a digital identity? I think it's fair to say that we're seeing more and new innovative digital solutions to verify identity at onboarding and in fact beyond. So we're seeing a major shift in the digital identity space. It's actually going mainstream. So whether it's big tech wanting to drive adoption of their wallets, private companies, governments, payments companies, big tech, there's just loads of different companies looking to get in on the opportunity of digital identity. And with these methods, one thing that they really have in common is that they are all about the consumer. It's a consumer first approach. What does that mean? Well, it's mobile first, recognizing that everybody's controlling their lives these days from their mobile phones, and actually over 60% of the world's population are expected to be using mobile wallets by 2026, according to Juniper. And we're already seeing it today in payments, Samsung Pay, Apple Pay, Google Pay, for example. And the other trend is privacy first. So following heightened scrutiny around social media, you might have seen other big companies like Apple have campaigns around privacy and solutions like Hide My Email. It's all about kind of protecting consumer interests in the digital space. And also recognizing this kind of shift in lifestyle to a more hybrid model of a consumer journey might start online, then go offline, then go back online. So all of these different points are kind of feeding into what we consider for digital identity. And lastly, sorry, I didn't mean to change the slide. This is a $266 billion opportunity by 2027, according to Liminal. And what we're referring to is the market size for reusable identity. So it's really not insignificant. And so it's a really exciting time to be in identity, and we're excited to talk to you about it today. So let's start with why we're here and why this is such an opportunity. I think it's fair to say that back in the day, to try and understand where we are with digital identity, we need to think about where we've come from. And back in the day, proving your identity was literally a case of pulling out a digital driver's license or a passport and kind of showing that in person. Then came digital identity verification, which literally digitized that approach and is still used today as a really high assurance way of verifying identity to access services. Might be banking, might be e-mopeds, all kinds of different industries. But actually, there's a whole school of thought that when the internet was designed, it didn't really factor in identity, and it was creating this one-to-one relationship whereby a consumer would have to have multiple different accounts and different relationships with different businesses. And single sign-on tried to kind of change that, but it only got so far. And then if you think about how websites use cookies to track users online, whether it's page traffic, impressions, it was kind of creating these unofficial digital identities, which brought about skepticism among consumers, made them more wary about what data they're sharing at what point, who they're sharing it with, and that in turn made people much more conscious of their privacy online. And recently in an Experian report, they cited that 79% of consumers actually cited privacy as their biggest concern online. But in the last couple of years, one of the biggest pivots we've seen was as a result of the pandemic. Amy, would you agree with that? And how do you think the pandemic influenced how society operates today?
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. With the pandemic, we went from mainly in person to fully remote, and now folks are operating very much in a hybrid world where we're controlling many of our day-to-day activities on our mobile phones or online, as you pointed out. There's some research from McKinsey that noted that we saw about 7 years worth of digital transformation compressed into 2 years as a result of the pandemic. So that's really changed people's approach and causes companies to have to think differently than they were thinking previously. Now there are so many points in a journey that a customer has to verify who they are or something about themselves. And we're seeing that individuals find using static IDs as a point of friction. And at the same time, we're also seeing that fraudsters are continuing to try and take advantage of our digital identity infrastructure. A great example here, and an unfortunate one, is what happened in the US with pandemic benefits fraud.
Yeah, we actually saw a lot of that in the UK as well. Jeremy, how have you seen the pandemic affect the need to get smarter about digital identity?
Well, I think it's hitting some of the themes Amy did. I mean, one, we found ourselves suddenly in a situation where you couldn't do anything in person, and so everything was forced online. And with it, we saw organized criminals across the globe really leap at the opportunity, in part because I think whether it's in the US, the UK, Europe, I mean, really every place across the globe, there's, what I often refer to as the identity gap between, every country has a series of, what I would say are nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, which have generally worked for in-person transactions. And when it comes to the online world, it's much more uneven. I mean, here in the US, we basically have nothing in terms of digital identity infrastructure. We're seeing some other countries, perhaps make some, leaps toward it. But there was basically a gap that was really easy for a lot of organized criminals, and in some cases, nation state actors to exploit. And so, I feel like now we're still in the middle across the globe of coming to grips with sort of what happened in terms of the fraud, as well as the real damage it did. Here in the US, there were plenty of horror stories, not only of criminals stealing money, but on the flip side, you might have somebody who was a bartender who was out of work for 4 months and couldn't actually convince the state that they were who they said they were to get their unemployment benefits, and was facing eviction from their apartment. And so it was, just a real mess. So I think the good news is now that everybody's sort of, look, folks like us have been looking at this issue for years. The pandemic really put it front and center. Now people are starting to think about what actually happens next and how can we start to harden the digital side of identity in the same way that, we've been doing on the physical side for years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen many shifts as well from a regulatory standpoint to protect consumers. So let's have a look at the digital landscape and how it's changing. I know in Europe, in the EU, It's heavily regulated, and thanks to the introduction of EIDAS 2.0, which is going to come into force in September this year, it's going to mandate that all EU citizens will have access to a digital identity wallet. And then in the UK, we see bills like the Online Safety Bill, which is to protect minors from inappropriate content online, that's going to put pressure on large tech platforms to care about the safety of their users, think about age verification, think about, you know, how they should be verifying their users. Jeremy, what's your perspective on what's happening in Europe, and how does that compare with what's happening in the United States?
So Europe's very interesting to me. I mean, just, you know, with what you're seeing with EIDAS version 2 and, you know, this focus on digital wallets, you know, you have a strategy that's really led by those at the highest levels of government to try and close this gap between physical and digital. And I think there's a broader discussion around, is it the right solution, or is every aspect of it the right solution? But there's no doubt that it's a priority. Here in the US, we're kind of upside down. We're seeing new laws passed in some of the states around age verification, but there's no focus on ensuring that there's actually the digital identity infrastructure to support it. And so I think what you're seeing in many cases is, you know, companies and governments are sort of scrambling right now to figure out what solutions they can get from the private sector to, you know, help support some of these requirements, not to mention just the need that, you know, through, you know, digital transformation, you know, customers are assuming you can do everything online, even if the risk model is such that if I don't know who you are, it's pretty risky to do so. You know, within the US, look, one of the projects I'm involved with, I run an organization called the Better Identity Coalition, which is really focused on what I'd call the policy layer of digital identity. And central to it is the idea that the US needs an approach to actually close this gap between physical and digital. So there's legislation that came close to passing in Congress last year, sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats. This hasn't been a partisan issue, called the Improving Digital Identity Act. That bill was recently reintroduced in the Senate, actually might get marked up in the next couple of days in a key committee in the Senate. So I'm, you know, bullish that the US is going to get there, but definitely a few steps behind Europe right now in terms of looking to tackle this issue strategically.
Yeah. Amy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a couple things. One stat I saw recently that's really stuck out to me about Europe is come 2030, we should expect 80% of Europeans to have access to a digital identity. That's a really striking percentage. And I know, Claire, you said all EU citizens, but just seeing that statistic for me was really compelling to understand what's going on in Europe. As Jeremy noted, the US is just so different. In part because identity at its core is a state function, it's not a federal function. And so it's really hard, with the exception of the social security number, of course, it's really hard for the US to have a unified solution here. And so you're seeing different states move forward with mobile driver's licenses, but they're doing so at different rates. And Jeremy talked about the Improving Digital Identity Act, which at one point it really looked at grant funding, but grant funding has become really difficult on Capitol Hill after the pandemic, in part because states hadn't fully used all the money that they've been given from the federal government. So there's a reluctance to give them more funding. And so what does that mean in terms of being able to get the infrastructure in place here to keep up with the state laws that, as Jeremy pointed out, we just saw Utah this past week put a pretty strict age verification law on the books for social media, saying that if you're under 18, you can't have a social media account unless your parent signs off. That's going to require age verification. But do we have the infrastructure in Utah to do that? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We're seeing very big variations market by market, and actually coming from the payment space, I see a lot of parallels between in terms of market behavior. So for example, there are leapfrog markets. With payments, you saw how China went from pretty much a cash economy straight to QR and wallet payments. While with digital identity, we're seeing similar behavior with India and how it went to Aadhaar and DigiLocker, Aadhaar being the world's largest biometric system. And then similarly in Europe, we're seeing Nordics being ahead. We've got a few markets where EIDs have really taken a strong foothold. Sweden's Bank ID, for example, I think there's something like 98% adoption there. And then, like you were saying, in the US, it's kind of interesting. There's this state-by-state level consideration, but then I also remember in payments, chip and PIN rolled out the same year that sort of Apple Pay was rolling out. And you think about how Apple's working to introduce some of these state mobile driver's license. And at the same time, some of the states with the COVID vaccines, they were just written on a piece of paper. So you can kind of see these discrepancies, and it's really interesting how it's playing out. Jeremy, what are your observations at more of a global level about how digital identity verification is, differing market by market?
I think you captured it pretty well. I mean, I think, if there's one thing that's true, it's, you can look at two countries and you can say you've looked at two countries. There's really no two that are doing exactly the same thing. There is certainly, I think, as you look across the globe, most countries have something in place right now. I would say the US is, quite unique actually, in that there is no current strategy or national focus. The closest we've come in the Biden administration is the recent national cybersecurity strategy flagged digital identity as a priority, and talked at a high level about starting to focus on making investments in some key things that could close this gap between physical and digital. It's a high level strategy. It's very well written. A lot really would depend on the implementation plan. But I think one thing you've seen, getting back to, if you look at two countries, you've looked at two countries, is that this really is something that I think every country thinks about a little bit differently, in part because the values of different countries, are a little bit different. So, if I look at China, where I can point to a lot of infrastructure, it's also, an increasingly authoritarian society that, is looking to build this with the idea that we're also going to track your every move. And in fact, it's going to become a tool of the state. That is something that I don't think is going to fly very well in the West. And so I think one of the challenges we have is, how do we balance security in the system with privacy and the ability to be anonymous or pseudonymous? This is something that I think we've struggled with for years. Where I'm kind of bullish is that I think some of the technologies on the privacy enhancing side that we were looking at sort of as R&D projects 10 years ago, certainly when I was at NIST funding pilots, a lot of them are now maturing. And so I think we're now seeing a way where you really can have it all. You can have security, you can have convenience, and you can have privacy built in. Now it's a matter of, coming up with the right frameworks, the right initiatives to actually deliver all of that. But I'll say, look, certainly in the US, and I think in a lot of other countries, we are essentially, because we don't have any strategy here, largely dependent on an industry of companies trying to come up with very innovative ways to guess what only the government knows. Government's the only authoritative issuer of identity, but if they don't close the gap between physical and digital, well, we've got good companies like Onfido who've got really cool solutions to try and help people figure it out. And so I think there's an interesting, question, whether it's here or in other countries where that's the approach. How does the market evolve over time? Does government come in, start to take a bigger role? And then, I don't think there's any place where government's going to provide the entire solution. I think there's always going to be a role for industry, but it will be interesting to see how the commercial identity market also evolves with this, perhaps by providing, say, alternatives to, state-written wallets or state-crafted wallets that, some people might be more comfortable with carrying their credentials in instead.
Yeah. Amy, you touched on data privacy. Amy, how do you see data privacy playing into all of this?
I think data privacy and identity, as Jeremy noted, are very much linked and really important when you're thinking about the direction of future travel. The US market, part of the reason why it's different is because in Europe they have GDPR and in the US we don't. That allows for different types of solutions when it comes to identity verification, but the landscape is also rapidly changing in the US. We know that Iowa is the latest state to pass a data privacy law. So now we've got 6 states out of 50 that have a law in the books, but we've got other states each week that keep introducing bills and taking a look at legislation. And so that patchwork of state laws is continuing to grow. We've got a ways to go before we get a federal privacy law. We saw a lot of action last Congress, and that was really exciting for those of us in the privacy space to see some bipartisan movement that really tackled some of the big issues in this space. However, they're maybe on the 5 or 10 yard line. They're in the red zone, but they are not scoring the touchdown yet. So we've got a little ways to go here. But what's very clear is that it remains a strong bipartisan interest, both in the House and in the Senate, and that the Biden administration has focused on this, with President Biden mentioning it in the State of the Union. So it's certainly a topic that we haven't heard the last of, but is going to be a pretty big deal going forward. But ultimately, even without a federal law in the books, as Jeremy mentioned, given the direction of state laws, we should expect to see an increased focus on privacy-centric approaches, and that's what's really going to help move the needle in the digital identity space.
Jeremy, what do you see as being some of the biggest benefits of digital identity?
Well, I talk a lot about the idea of identity as the great enabler, meaning it's really hard to get it right, but when you get it right, you're delivering better security, better privacy, and better customer experiences. And I think with it, I talk a lot about the idea of good identity as infrastructure, that you can really build a lot of other things off of it when you start with identity as the foundation. And whether it's the criminal challenges we're seeing these days, where it is an anomaly when a major attack happens, where a lot of money or a lot of data is stolen and identity is not the attack vector. The ability to give consumers more control over their data, and perhaps have better privacy with it, and just the types of new digital services you can bring online, where there's still a lot of things these days where if you do not have the ability, if you're a company or a government agency, to know with a pretty good level of assurance who is really on the other end of a transaction, you're not going to be looking to put that service online, because the risk is just so much that, as we saw, some of the government programs during the pandemic, criminals are very good at exploiting these issues. So I think it really is that magic combination of security and privacy and customer experience that you can then build a whole bunch of things off of online. To that point, I know there was a study a few years ago, I think it was McKinsey, that pointed out, looking at different regions across the globe, what the total increase in gross domestic product could be in these countries if they actually had digital identity infrastructure. I think for the US, it was 3 or 4%. Which is a pretty stunning number in terms of the economic growth that you can generate, that of course then benefits the whole country and everybody in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's really exciting, the kind of new use cases that are opening up or can potentially be opened up with digital identity. Things like, well, if you think of the online and the offline journey coming together, things like being able to join a virtual queue instead of standing in line, being able to check in at a hotel without having to hand your passport over. Maybe you want to do age-restricted or access age-restricted services, but you don't necessarily want to reveal every detail on your passport. So yeah, it's interesting. I totally agree with you, and it's creating more efficiencies generally. And also, I think with this, a lot of these digital identities are kind of taking a decentralized approach. So where the data on individuals is either stored on the user's device or just not stored in a central database, which might otherwise be a good target for a fraudster or a cyber hacker if they so wished. But I don't think they come without their challenges. Amy, what do you think are the biggest challenges for EIDs and digital IDs in general?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, there's a lot of opportunities as you talked about, but at the end of the day, if a business isn't accepting an EID, if there's not a network of folks that are able to use this, then they aren't helpful. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, where you need to make sure that folks have digital IDs, but they also have to be able to use them, because it does me no good to have an ID on my phone that I can't use anywhere. So that network of acceptance is really important. But also just the challenges, we live in a global world, and part of what's interesting about the digital identity landscape is we're also seeing standards, and I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but standards rapidly evolving, and making sure that what you have on your device is something that you can use in different use cases, since the assurance level needed is going to vary depending on what you're trying to do. It's a lot lower risk if I'm trying to buy a movie ticket per se than if I'm trying to get a prescription drug. So trying to understand what the use cases are and how they vary. We've seen a lot of this with the government recently in the US with the discussion around IAL2 and the NIST standards and what's really required there for accessing government websites. I think the other challenge here, and we saw this with the pandemic, is that fraudsters are going to keep getting more sophisticated. They don't rest, and that means that the technology has to continue to develop and become more sophisticated to fight that as well. I know Onfido publishes an annual fraud report where we talk about some of the trends we're seeing there, but that medium sophistication fraud, where some of these things aren't perceptible to human eye, are things that fraudsters are doing. And then ultimately, I think the other big question here that we're going to have to solve when it comes to digital identity is delegation. I can send my spouse to the pharmacy to pick up my prescription. How do we do that in a world where we're relying on digital IDs? Who can I delegate, especially in the senior community, when you're thinking about folks who are aging and how they're thinking about their end of life choices, when they're unable to make their own decisions. How do you delegate those identities and do it in a way that the individuals are comfortable with and that they can have the ability to select those individuals?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you make. And when thinking of vulnerability of older generations in general and sort of fraud trends, I think we saw an uptick in kind of social engineering and those kind of techniques during the pandemic, especially romance fraud, things like that. So there's also these different ways that older generations are going to feel a bit more vulnerable, perhaps, adopting this technology and things that we need to be mindful of as a society. The delegation point is really interesting, and I don't think it's been figured out yet. With your points around fraud and interoperability, though, how do you think a company can mitigate those risks? I think it's about improving or going with the highest level of assurance possible at onboarding and making sure you're adding in layers of protection and defense against fraud and making sure that that initial onboarding point is as secure as possible. But it's also about conforming to the highest standards, things like ETSI in Europe, which is the technical standards framework. You mentioned NIST, IAL2 in the US. Jeremy, why are standards so important, and what do they mean for businesses?
Well, I think standards, play a few roles. First, it's just about making sure you're doing things the right way. And I think we've certainly seen this, in different places where if you're looking to, how do I say it, roll your own solution, but you haven't actually vetted it against, the different types of potential attacks that might be coming against it, you might find yourself by not following standards, suddenly in a position where there's the vulnerability that you never bothered to look at that, is perhaps addressed in the standard. I think standards are also really important from the perspective of interoperability, in that if I am building a solution, for one state, but I want it to be used by, a major, bank or retailer that's doing business in all 50 states, well, here in the US, I think this, really goes across the globe as well. Companies are going to have a really hard time integrating with a, single state specific solution. Whereas if you actually have standards, this is, when I talked before about this idea of identity as a great enabler and how, countries can help grow their economies, businesses can grow their top line revenues and also make more money. Standards really lower the cost of integration and make things easy to use for everybody. And so I think that's quite important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, beyond standards, what else do you think companies should consider when they're thinking about their digital identity solutions?
Yeah, a topic right now that is certainly getting a lot of attention in Washington and is one that is something to really think about is how to be inclusive when talking about digital identity verification. Because ultimately, digital identity creates the opportunity for solutions that are more inclusive than previous approaches. Because if you think about it, aside from the fact that so much personal information is on the dark web, unfortunately, as a result of data breaches, previous approaches to identity verification used knowledge-based approaches, which meant that we were dependent on information in credit files, which we all know can be a problem for minorities, for women, for recent immigrants. And so what we see with the hope and the opportunity of digital identity infrastructure is that more individuals are able to control and to access information. That said, it's really important to make sure these solutions work for everyone, specifically ones that use facial recognition. It's important to think about, when you're looking at a company, what is their commitment to anti-bias? How do they approach building their model? How do they approach improving their model? Are they making very direct steps in order to make sure that their models work for everyone? Because certainly we can't have digital identity infrastructure that relies on facial recognition technology that only works for a subset of the population. Certainly this is a place that Onfido has done a lot of work, and we're really proud of that work and have focused on it, whether it's through the ICO sandbox in 2019 or through our more recent work where we published a white paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's wrap up with what all this means for eKYC. Well, I think it's fair to say that companies need to get ready for this shift towards digital identity and consider that different markets are going to adopt different methods at different paces. It's going to be more important than ever to onboard users at the highest level of assurance possible, and they need to find partners who understand this landscape and able to help them navigate these changes so that they can bring all of their user base on the journey with them and make sure that it's as inclusive as possible. I think this is a really exciting time. There's still many things to be figured out, but there's a ton of opportunity to get excited about. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. Before we open up for Q&A, I'd like to hand over to Amy to share a few words about women and identity.
Thanks, Claire. And as we close out Women's History Month, we wanted to take a moment just to highlight one of our favorite organizations here at Onfido. Women and Identity was established in 2019 as a volunteer-run international nonprofit that promotes diversity and inclusion in the identity industry. And look at Jeremy with the sticker. I promise we didn't even plan that. You can see their mission and vision on the slide. Women and Identity seeks to drive the digital identity industry to build solutions that promote universal access to online services by leveraging diverse teams. Since 2019, Women in Identity has 2,200 members, 32 volunteers across 40 countries. We're really proud here at Onfido to be a platinum sponsor of Women in Identity and encourage all those who are in the identity industry to check out their website.
Awesome. So let's take some questions. Bear with me. Question one from Nick. Are we seeing anything in the industry on the US side for digital solutions for entity, ID, and V?
So I guess my question there is, what do you mean by entity? Does it mean like a legal company, or are we talking about entities as in like identities of Internet of Things? I think the short answer is yes to both of them, but it's probably two different answers. I don't know if I want to spend too much time going down one path and perhaps going down the wrong one to answer the question.
Yeah, and certainly KYB is probably a big part of this question, and we're seeing interesting pushes around not only knowing the business, but also knowing the people involved in the business. I think beneficial ownership and the push by FinCEN as a result of a recent legislation is a good example here of absolutely you are seeing identity verification, not only about the customer and the individual, but also the businesses and the people working within the businesses.
Thanks, Amy. We also have a question from Paul. What about using mobile intelligence solutions for verification, authentication, and fraud prevention products? Before we go on to that, Nick has just responded with business. So business, ID, and V.
Yeah, so I think to Amy's point on that, we're definitely seeing more of it, and there's new rules here in the U.S. with FinCEN and beneficial ownership. We've also seen, I think more globally, but less in the U.S., the adoption of new solutions like the LEI, the legal entity identifier. It has not, I would say, caught on as much in the U.S. as it has in some other areas. it has been hard, as Amy pointed out, when you start getting with the complexities of different corporate structures and actually trying to figure out who the actual owners are, where it's an LLC wrapped around an LLC, wrapped around another one. It's been difficult, but we're starting to see, in part because Congress, passed a law saying we needed more transparency on this. The regulators are starting to push for solutions. I think here, the technology is actually going to be, in some cases, less important than what the policymakers and the regulators call for, and that they're going to really dictate a lot of the solutions, given, bluntly, the reluctance of some entities to actually be properly identified.
Thanks, Jeremy. So back to Paul's question, what about using mobile intelligence solutions for verification, authentication, and fraud prevention products? I think it's going to become increasingly important. As we alluded to at the beginning, mobile is going to be central to all of this. So I think more and more layers of defense and more intelligence around the device being used, especially kind of passive solutions, is going to become ever more critical in protecting consumers and also protecting businesses against fraud.
But I think, Claire, that's a place where, kind of getting to Jeremy's earlier point, what the policymakers say is really going to matter. So when we're watching what's happening in data privacy legislation, trying to understand how that's going to affect the ability to use tools like device intelligence in order to fight fraud, and are there fraud carve-outs in the legislation that allow for those tools, and will individuals allow for their data to be used that way? Because if they say, don't use my data, don't remember me, it makes it a little more challenging, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with, as certainly fraudsters, part of their business model is they don't follow the law. And so therefore they really don't care that you can't do those things, but they will, as we've seen with the pandemic, exploit weaknesses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say on that point, I mean, part of our challenge in this space is we're basically in an arms race against our adversaries who, as Amy pointed out, aren't really concerned about the laws or regulations or whatnot. And they will basically, exploit any angle that they can. Which makes it very hard if you are on the defense side. You can be right 99% of the time, but if you're wrong 1%, well, now you have a major incident on your hands. So they only have to be right on the the bad guy side just 1% of the time to get the gains that they're looking for. So I think it has been a challenge, particularly as we're looking, certainly here in the U.S., at different states doing privacy laws, but not a federal law. As Amy pointed out, making sure you have those carve-outs where, look, you want to put restrictions on the use of data for marketing or other, what people would call product enhancements. That's, fine. That's one bucket, but that is also one of the best tools that we have, particularly the ability to collect it and analyze it, to be looking for signals that something might not be right. And so I think making sure we have those proper carve-outs is going to be very important to the role of those technologies going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And I think question 3 from Jack. When I think of fraud, I traditionally tend to think of hackers. What's being done specifically in the digital identity space to prevent fraud? I think you touched on this already.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's look, whether it's a hacker, or a nation state actor, an organized crime gang. I mean, they're all generally taking advantage of what I continue to call this identity gap, which is the things that might work in person don't really work online. And so that creates a lot of different opportunities if you're looking to do something with, shall I say, less than pure intentions, to exploit some of these weaknesses in digital identity infrastructure, to steal money, steal data. Look, we've seen this in other areas where things are even more nefarious. So I think we're just in this constant arms race, and industry's innovating a lot. Government is starting to step up across the globe to come up with digital counterparts to the authoritative credentials that it issues. But this problem's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think this is a space where the sophistication of the technology matters, and so customers are going to have to be pretty sophisticated in asking questions of their vendors about how they're thinking about 2D versus 3D attacks. How do they look at masks? How are they training their models? Do they require you to move your face when doing a facial recognition? Because that motion piece can be a way to stop some of the fraud. But certainly fraudsters get more sophisticated, the technology's got to keep up. And as Jeremy pointed out, it's an arms race.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add to that, a lot of the standards, especially in Europe with ETSI, consider this, and they're making moves to make it the highest level of assurance possible, to mitigate things like injection attacks. So when you're looking at a solution for onboarding, you really need to think about a multi-layered approach. So can you detect repeat fraud and synthetic identity fraud, which tends to be very subtle, and maybe it's making small changes in credentials and mixing fictitious credentials with real credentials to appear genuine. Are you protecting against all kinds of biometric spoofs, presentation attacks? Yeah, and then on top of that, there's kind of these more passive layers of defense to consider. So all of these attacks that we see today are going to continue existing, and perhaps more so. So it's really important to stay on top of fraud trends and find solutions that are going to protect you. Next question, what does this panel see in terms of innovations to come in the next few years? Who would like to go first?
I mean, I think the big one that we talked a lot about that's going to be the game changer is these EIDs, and understanding how they change the market and what opportunities they open up. That's a very different iteration. We've gone from knowledge-based authentication to a doc and face type of world, and now we're going to a user-controlled identity that they're going to be able to present. So how does that work? Who reads them? Who accepts them? And what that network looks like is going to be really interesting. And it's going to be different, as Jeremy pointed out, from Europe to the US, where the US we're more likely to see private label digital identities and how those credentials work. It's going to be a really fascinating next couple of years in the identity space.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add on top of that is AI is, I think, going to become much more important. So the last few years, we've started to take advantage of AI and machine learning and the tools we're using to guard against attacks. Now the attackers are getting smart and they're using it as well. And so I think people are just starting to grasp how, in many cases, it's going to be a question of who has better artificial intelligence tools at their disposal to, try and either protect against identity fraud or commit it.
Yeah, and final thoughts from my side. I agree with all of the above. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the ecosystem shapes up. It's going to be much more about partnerships. It's going to be, probably we'll see a consolidation, especially during this economic climate. And we'll see some clear leaders in the marketplace. But what's interesting is that businesses are going to have to pivot their ambitions to really create the best experience for the consumer, and that's a shift that we're moving towards, and it's going to become even more important, and that, as Amy said, relies on a really strong network. So yeah, thank you so much everybody for listening. Some really great questions there. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jeremy, for joining the discussion. It was really great to have all of your insights. And thank you, everybody. That's it for today.
Thank you.